My son Julian arrived for Thanksgiving in a car that hummed with a quiet, expensive dignity I didn't understand. It was sleek black and completely out of place, parked on the gravel road leading up to my workshop, a monument to a life Julian had long since outgrown. The last time I'd seen him was at his mother's funeral, a brief, strained affair where we spoke only in hushed, functional sentences about arrangements and logistics, never about the gaping, terrible loss that was Sarah. 3 years had passed since then, a slow, grinding eternity marked by the tick of the antique clock on my mantel and the subtle, creeping decay of this old house. It had been ours, Sarah's and mine, and by extension Julian's, but in her absence, it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for a past I couldn't quite bury. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sawdust, the familiar perfume of my life's work. My hands, still steady and strong despite the years, bore the indelible marks of a man who worked with wood. Every callus, every scar told a story of a beam hewn, a table crafted, a chair carved. They were honest hands, the kind that built things. But in the quiet after Sarah's death, I found myself unable to build much of anything. My workshop, once a place of creation, had become a refuge from the silent, hollow rooms of the house. I had set up a makeshift table in the center of the vast space, surrounded by the ghosts of projects, half-finished, the air, a tangible weight of history and regret. It was here in this sanctuary of wood and ghosts that my sister Mary had insisted we hold Thanksgiving. She thought the change of scenery might do us good, might finally break the long, icy silence that had fallen between me and my boy. She was wrong. Julian emerged from the car, a sharp-edged figure in a perfectly tailored coat, a man who moved with the calculated grace of someone accustomed to polished floors and clean hands. He didn't look like my son. My son, the boy I taught to sand wood until it was as smooth as river stone, had hands that were always a little dirty, nails perpetually stained with oil and sawdust. This man had manicured hands, an expensive watch catching the weak November light. His posture was rigid, his shoulders squared as if to shield himself from the dusty reality of his old life. He didn't look at the house, didn't seem to notice the peeling paint or the rusted hinge on the front gate. His eyes, the same piercing blue as Sarah's, were fixed on the workshop door, a closed-off, impenetrable wall. My sister Mary and her family were already here, having arrived earlier with a flurry of pies and casseroles. Her husband David, a kind, gentle man who had always tried to bridge the unbridgeable, gave me a look of quiet sympathy. Their 2 children, now teenagers, were huddled in a corner, their phones glowing in the dim light, a modern cocoon against the awkwardness that permeated the room. They were a cheerful, noisy bunch, but their laughter seemed to get swallowed up by the vast, oppressive quiet of the workshop. Julian walked into the room and the silence thickened, becoming something you could almost touch. The air, already heavy, grew colder. He offered a perfunctory nod in my direction. There was no warmth in it, no sense of homecoming. It was the gesture of a stranger acknowledging a brief acquaintance. He didn't meet my gaze, choosing instead to look at the tools on the workbench, the stacks of lumber, the things that defined my life. My sister Mary, ever the diplomat, rushed to greet him with a hug, but even that felt stiff, unreciprocated. She said something about how good it was to see him and asked if he had had a good drive. Julian just gave her a brief, flat smile and said that the traffic had been light. He spoke with a quiet precision, each word measured and devoid of emotion. He was a master of a kind of communication that said nothing at all. We sat down at the table, a strange little collection of people pretending this was a normal family gathering. The food was good. Mary was a fantastic cook, but it felt like sustenance for an assembly, not a shared meal. I watched Julian from across the table. His shoulders were still tense, his jaw tight. He picked at his food, his movements economical and controlled. My mind drifted back to a different time, a different kitchen, one filled with the scent of Sarah's cooking and the sound of Julian's boyish laughter. He used to come home from school and tell me about his day in a rush of breathless enthusiasm, his words tumbling over each other. He was a curious, passionate kid, always asking me questions about the projects I was working on, his eyes wide with a deep-seated fascination for how things were made. He had wanted to be a builder like me, but with a different kind of ambition, he had said. He wanted to build structures that touched the sky, to create things that would last forever. I had been so proud of him. David, ever the peacemaker, tried to spark a conversation. He said something about how well Julian was doing in the city, how he had seen his name in an article about a new skyscraper downtown. Julian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and said it was just another project. My sister Mary, emboldened by David's attempt, tried to pry more. She asked if he was dating anyone, if he was happy. Julian's response was clipped, saying he was too busy for a social life. and that happiness was a luxury. His words hung in the air, a cold clinical dismissal of our concern. It was a familiar pattern, the way he shut us all out. The real tension, the thing that had been simmering beneath the surface all afternoon, came when he stood up to leave. He said he had a flight to catch early the next morning and had to get back to the city. My heart sank a familiar leaden weight. I had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that he would stay the night, that we might have a moment, just one, to talk. But I said nothing. My throat was too tight, the words locked behind a wall of pride and hurt. He gave a brief, distant farewell to Mary and David. Then he turned to my granddaughter Chloe, a sweet, quiet girl who was Julian's niece. He handed her a small, elegant box. It was black and sleek, with a single, tasteful logo stamped on the lid. Chloe looked at him with a shy curiosity and then looked at me, her eyes questioning. Julian gave her a thin smile and told her it was a new model, and he hoped she would get a lot of use out of it. She opened the box, her eyes widening. Inside was a pair of sleek wireless headphones. They looked impossibly small and modern, something from a different planet. Chloe gasped in quiet awe and thanked her uncle. She said something about them being the most beautiful headphones she had ever seen. Julian just nodded. My daughter Mary said something about it being a very generous gift, but her voice was strained. That's when I felt it, the familiar and terrible pressure on my chest. It wasn't just a gift. It was a statement. The headphones, so small, so perfect, so expensive, were a symbol of everything that had been lost, of a promise that had been shattered. I looked at the box and suddenly I wasn't in my workshop anymore. I was back in time, standing in a different workshop, a workshop that still felt like home. It was a cold winter, a year before Sarah got sick. Julian was home from college for the holidays. He was full of energy, full of ideas. He had a project for me. He had sketches, detailed drawings of a new kind of chair, a minimalist design with clean lines and perfect angles. It was beautiful, truly an artist's creation. He wanted me to help him build a prototype. He said we could go into business together, a partnership between my old world craftsmanship and his new world design. We'd call ourselves Reyes and Son. I remember thinking it was the greatest thing I had ever heard. We spent weeks on that chair. I taught him how to choose the wood, how to feel its grain and understand its strength. He showed me how to use the new CAD software to create precise cuts, how to imagine the finished product from a different perspective. We had a rhythm, a quiet, comfortable dance of old and new. The chair was perfect, a stunning combination of raw material and modern design. It was a testament to our partnership, a symbol of everything we could build together. Then Julian came to me with a plan. He had been approached by a company, a new startup that wanted to mass-produce the chair. But there was a condition. The company wanted to buy the design outright, and they wanted Julian to move to the city to oversee the production. I asked him about our partnership, about our plan to build things together. He looked at me and his eyes, so full of the future, were suddenly cold. He told me he couldn't do it, couldn't live a life of sawdust and sweat. He told me his future was in the city. I remember asking him if he would at least take the blueprints, the designs that we had worked on together, so we could build them ourselves and keep our company. He told me he had signed a confidentiality agreement and the designs belonged to the company. My throat tightened with anger and betrayal. I asked him if he had sold the chair, the thing we had built together, for nothing. He looked at me, and with a voice that was too flat, too devoid of emotion, he told me that he had gotten paid enough to cover his college tuition and then some. The words hit me like a physical blow. He had sold our partnership, our legacy, for a paycheck. I remember standing in the workshop, my hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white, the wood under my nails seeming to bite into my skin. Julian had looked at me, and with a voice that was both apologetic and utterly dismissive, he told me that he couldn't let sentimentality get in the way of a good business deal. He said I just didn't understand the way the world worked. I looked down at the headphones in Chloe's hands, a small, perfect object, a sterile and meaningless gift. It was a new model, Julian had said, a new model for his niece. I remembered the blueprints, our blueprints, a new model for our company. The betrayal felt as fresh and as raw as it had that day. He hadn't sold the chair, he had sold me. He had sold our dream for a paycheck. I looked at Julian, his face, a perfect mask of polite indifference. He was a stranger in my home. He had no interest in the life I had built, in the man I was, or in the man he had once been. He had bought his way out of the past, out of the life of a son who worked with his hands, out of the life of a son who understood the value of an honest day's work. He had left not just to the city but to a different world entirely, a world where things were made of plastic and metal and were bought and sold, a world where the only thing that mattered was money and success, a world where he would never have to be a son to me again. He turned to me, his face devoid of emotion. He said goodbye to me, but his eyes were already somewhere else. He was already gone. I felt the last threads of hope snap. The quiet hum of his expensive car outside was a final damning statement. He had come back for a brief moment, but he had already left. And he was leaving with my granddaughter's admiration, and he was leaving me with a ghost, a haunting memory of a son who had once wanted to build things with his father, of a life that we had once shared. I stood there watching him walk away, and I felt the truth of his betrayal, a pain so deep that I knew it would never heal. The silence that Julian left behind was a physical thing. It clung to the sawdust in the air, settled on the half-finished projects on my workbench, and pressed down on my shoulders with a weight that was far heavier than any of the lumber I'd ever hoisted. The hum of his expensive car had faded into the distant roar of the interstate, a sound I had come to associate with his absence, a final guttural sigh of departure. My sister and her family had left soon after him, their cheerful goodbyes, feeling like a polite lie in the face of the chasm that had opened up between me and my son. David had put a hand on my shoulder, his touch, a silent offering of comfort, and told me to take care of myself. I nodded, but I knew he meant more than just my physical well-being. He meant my heart, which felt like a piece of shattered glass I was trying to hold together with my bare hands. I spent the next few days in a daze, the rhythm of my life completely thrown off balance. I went through the motions of a man in his routine, but my mind was a restless, churning sea. The workshop, once my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every object in it, the smooth grain of a maple plank, the gleaming steel of a chisel, the warm glow of a lamp I had made for Sarah, reminded me of Julian. Not the man who had come for Thanksgiving, but the boy he had once been. I'd pick up a piece of sandpaper and see the calluses on my own hands, and I would remember teaching Julian how to sand a piece of wood until it was as smooth as riverstone. I'd see the intricate joinery on a cabinet and remember Julian's drawings, his precise, perfect lines. The memory was a ghost that haunted me, a constant, painful reminder of what we had once shared. The sterile, meaningless gift he had given Chloe, those impossibly small, perfect headphones, sat on a shelf, a silent accusation. I looked at it and saw not a gift, but a statement. It was a symbol of a world I didn't understand, a world where the things that mattered were bought and sold, where a beautiful object was just a commodity, not something built with love and care. I remembered the blueprints for our chair, the one we had built together, the one he had sold for a paycheck. The betrayal felt as fresh as it had all those years ago. It had been more than just a business deal. It had been a betrayal of me, of my way of life, of everything I believed in. And now he had come back and given me a new kind of wound, a deeper one. He had come back not as a son, but as a ghost from a different world, a world where our past meant nothing at all. Then the call came. My phone, an old reliable thing I only used for emergencies, rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. The only people who called me were Mary or the occasional client, and I knew this wasn't either. The phone rang and I let it ring. But then I saw a text message on the screen, a message that simply said, "Dad, pick up. It's Julian." The words were cold, clipped in order, not a request. I answered the phone, my voice raw and guarded. Julian's voice was different from what I remembered. It was no longer the quiet, controlled voice of a stranger. It was a business voice, a voice that was practiced in the art of making a deal. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about Thanksgiving. He got straight to the point. He told me he was working on a project, a huge one, he said. It was a new residential development for the firm he worked for, a project that was going to change the city's skyline. My heart sank. I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold premonition of something terrible. He said the project required him to acquire a piece of land just outside the city, a large, undeveloped parcel. He said he was calling to give me a heads up, a courtesy, he said, before the company's real estate firm made a formal offer. He said he thought I might be interested since the property was so close to my home. He said the offer would be very generous. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, thudding rhythm of fear and dread. I could feel the betrayal building, a cold, bitter taste in my mouth. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I asked. If he meant the old Miller place, a vast, undeveloped tract of land just a few miles from my house. "No, Dad," he said. His voice was flat, a cold and impersonal tone completely devoid of emotion. He told me that he was talking about my land, my workshop, my home. He said he was going to buy it. My blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, a cruel, vicious punch to the gut. I felt the workshop, my sanctuary, my home begin to spin around me. He said he was going to buy it and he was going to tear it down. But why, I asked, my voice cracking. Why would you do that? I told him this was my home. This was my life. This was the place where he grew up. He sighed, a tired, impatient sound. He said it was just a business deal, a simple transaction. He said the location was perfect. The land was undeveloped and it was the perfect size for the project. I told him he couldn't do this. I told him he couldn't just come back and erase everything. He said he wasn't erasing anything. He said he was just making a smart business decision. He said the money would give me a new life, a new start. He said I could move to the city, get an apartment, and finally retire. He said I wouldn't have to work in a dusty old workshop for the rest of my life. He said he was doing this for me. His words hit me like a physical blow, a vicious, cruel lie. He wasn't doing this for me. He was doing this for him. He was trying to buy his way out of his past, out of the life he had so publicly left behind. He was trying to erase the last living monument to the man he had once been. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, that it took my breath away. He was trying to destroy the only thing I had left, the only thing that connected me to the life I had before Sarah died. Then he said something that cut deeper than anything else he had said. He told me that the land was worthless, a rusted, dilapidated mess. He said that the old house was falling apart, and that the workshop was nothing more than a dust-filled anachronism. He told me that he was doing me a favor by getting rid of it. I felt the blood rush to my head, a hot, angry wave of fury. He had come back and looked at my life, and he had seen nothing but failure. He had looked at the things I had built, the life I had lived, and he had seen nothing but a dilapidated mess. The words were a direct attack on my identity, on everything I had ever been. He said he had to go, that he had a meeting. He said he was sorry he had to do it this way, but that he had to be professional. He said the real estate firm would be in touch with a formal offer soon. He said it was non-negotiable. He told me to think about the money. He said it would change my life. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the dial tone. He had hung up. He had done what he came to do. He had delivered his final cruel blow, and then he had walked away. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the sawdust-covered floor. I looked around the workshop, my sanctuary, the place where I had built a life, and I saw it through his eyes. The dust, the rust, the peeling paint. He saw a project. He saw an acquisition. He saw a piece of property. He didn't see the life I had built here. He didn't see the love, the sweat, the tears. He didn't see the memory of a little boy with sawdust in his hair, his eyes wide with wonder as he watched his father build a table from a piece of wood. I walked over to the table and sat down, my legs trembling. My hands, the honest hands of a craftsman, felt foreign to me. They were hands that built things, not hands that were meant to hold on to something that was being ripped away. The phone call was a brutal confirmation of all my suspicions. He hadn't come back for Thanksgiving. He had come back to scope out the property. He had come back to see if it was worth buying. The gift to Chloe, the seemingly innocent small talk, the careful avoidance of any real conversation, it had all been a performance. He was a professional at betraying his own father. A hot, angry tear slipped down my cheek, a tear I hadn't shed in years. I felt the humiliation of his cruel words, the brutal, cutting dismissal of my life, and I felt the deeper, more profound pain of betrayal. He was not just trying to take my home, he was trying to take my memories. He was trying to take the last living remnants of Sarah and of a life we had built together. He was trying to sell me a new life that would be built on the ruins of my past, a new life that would be built on the pain of his betrayal. I stood up, my legs still shaking, and walked over to the workbench. I picked up a piece of lumber and held it in my hands. The grain was smooth and warm against my skin. It was a tangible, real thing. It was something I could build with. I looked around my workshop, at the tools, at the projects, at the dust-covered memories. This was my life. This was who I was. And I wasn't going to let him take it. He thought he could buy me out. He thought he could pay me to go away. But he was wrong. He didn't understand. The things that mattered were not for sale. The love, the memories, the life I had built here were not for sale. I looked down at the phone on the floor, a useless piece of technology, and I felt a new kind of resolve harden inside me. I wasn't going to run. I was going to stand my ground. He wanted to play a business game, a game of money and power. Fine. I would play his game, but I would play it on my terms. He would learn that a man who builds things with his hands is not so easily broken. He would learn that a life of honest work and love is worth more than any amount of money. The game had begun, and I knew I had to win. I had to win not just for me, but for Sarah and for the life that we had built together. He was not going to get away with it. He was not going to get away with destroying my home, my legacy, and the last remaining pieces of my heart. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. The sting of Julian's voice on the phone, the clinical transactional tone he used to describe a lifetime of memories, had turned the grief in my chest into something hard and sharp. The phone lay on the workshop floor where I had dropped it, a silent black rectangle. I didn't pick it up. I just stared at it, a useless piece of technology that had delivered a final brutal message. For the first time since Sarah died, I wasn't just grieving for what I had lost. I was grieving for what had been taken from me. The pain was a physical thing, a cold knot in my gut that no amount of work or quiet reflection could untangle. He had looked at my life, at my home, and he had seen nothing but an obstacle, a piece of land to be acquired, an old man to be bought off. The next few days were a blur of restless agony. Sleep was impossible. My mind, which usually found peace in the methodical rhythm of my hands at work, was a churning sea of questions and doubt. How could my son, the boy I had raised, look at our home and see only a commodity? I would walk through the house, my hand brushing against the worn wood of the banister, and I would feel the weight of his words, a dilapidated mess. I would look at the tools on my workbench, each one a memory of a project we had shared, and I would hear his voice, a dust-filled anachronism. The things that had always given me a sense of pride and purpose now seemed tainted, viewed through the cold, contemptuous lens of his world. It was during one of those sleepless nights sitting in my cold, dark workshop that the pain finally curdled into something else. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a fierce, singular resolve. My hands, which had built so many things, felt empty. I needed to do something. Julian had used the language of his world: contracts, acquisitions, business deals. I didn't know that language, but I was a man who understood blueprints, who understood structure, who knew that you had to look beneath the surface to find the truth. I decided I would fight him not with words or pleas, but with his own weapons. I would find the truth, the real truth behind his project. My investigation began the next morning at the county clerk's office, a place I hadn't been to in years. It was an old, solemn building, filled with the hushed rustle of paper and the dry scent of history. I felt a pang of loneliness, a new kind of isolation. My fight was mine alone. I couldn't tell Mary or David or anyone. They wouldn't understand. They would tell me to give up, to take the money, to move on. But this wasn't about the money. This was about my honor, my legacy, and the life Julian was trying to erase. I asked the clerk, a kind elderly woman with a weary smile, to help me with the property records for my address. I told her I was just doing some research. She seemed to sense my anxiety, and she quietly helped me navigate the maze of ledgers and documents. My hands, more accustomed to the feel of a rough-hewn plank, felt clumsy as I turned the brittle pages. My own name, my address stared back at me in the official, impersonal script of the law. I had owned this land for 35 years. It was a simple, uncomplicated fact. Then I asked her if there had been any recent filings related to my property. She gave me a quizzical look, but went to her computer. After a few clicks, she brought up a document on the screen. It was a notice of intent, an official form from a company I didn't recognize, but below it, the name of Julian's architectural firm was listed as a consultant. The document was a cold, formal confirmation of my worst fears. They had already begun the process. The land was being zoned for commercial use, a process that would require the demolition of my home and my workshop. It was all laid out in cold, calculated detail. They were a step ahead of me, already moving to claim what was mine. I felt a tremor of panic, a sickening feeling that I was already too late. I thanked the woman and left the office, the paper I had copied clutched in my hand. The sunlight outside felt harsh and unwelcome. The world was still turning, people were still going about their lives, but for me, everything had changed. The simple act of looking at a document had turned my quiet life into a battlefield. My next step was more difficult. Julian had mentioned a new skyscraper, a glowing profile of his firm. I knew I had to find it. I had to enter his world. I drove to the public library, a place I hadn't been to since Julian was a boy, when I would read him stories about cowboys and knights. The library was full of young people hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by the pale light of a different kind of world. I found an empty computer and sat down. My fingers, more familiar with the texture of a drill press, felt clumsy on the keyboard. I typed in Julian's name, then the name of his firm. I felt like an old man trying to understand a foreign language, but I persevered. And then I found it. A glowing professional profile of Julian on the firm's website. He was a partner now, a director. He was a visionary, a genius, a man who built the future. The words were a bitter mockery of the son I had raised. He was smiling in the photograph, a sharp, confident grin. I looked at the picture and I saw a stranger, a ghost with Sarah's eyes, a man who had sold his soul for a corporate title. I clicked on a link to his new project, the one he had mentioned. It was a glossy, animated rendering of a massive residential complex. The buildings were sterile and sleek, a testament to his ambition. A small portion of the site plan was blurred out, a rectangular shape on the edge of the property. I knew with a sickening certainty what that shape was. It was my home, my workshop, my life. The humiliation was a hot, bitter wave that washed over me. He had not just betrayed me, he had humiliated me. He had used my home as a mere footnote in his grand design, a blank space to be filled with his ambition. I felt the familiar pain in my chest, the cold knot of grief and betrayal. I closed the browser and stood up, my legs weak. I had seen enough. I had seen the truth. I had seen the monster he had become. I went home defeated. I sat at my workbench, the fluorescent lights of the shop casting long, pale shadows. I had a copy of a notice of intent. I had a digital rendering of my home as a blank space. I had all the evidence I needed to confirm his betrayal, but I had nothing to fight it with. He was a giant, a man who worked with money and influence, and I was just an old man with calloused hands and a broken heart. I was out of my depth. I was defeated. I reached for a dusty old binder that lay on a shelf beneath my workbench, a habit I had for years whenever I was defeated. It was a place for me to put forgotten things. I opened the binder, and my hand brushed against a thin sheaf of papers. They were old, yellowed blueprints. I hadn't looked at them in years. They were the blueprints for the chair, the one Julian and I had built together, the one he had sold for a paycheck. There was a section labeled Reyes and Son, with a drawing of a simple wooden chair with elegant lines. My eyes welled up with tears as I stared at the chair, a symbol of our shared dream, of the partnership he had so easily abandoned. I closed my eyes, a silent prayer escaping my lips for a life I would never have. I felt something folded within the papers. A small, crumpled piece of paper, a thin sheet of notebook paper with Julian's handwriting. It was a note I had forgotten. I unfolded it carefully. Julian's script was precise and neat, the handwriting of a boy who was meant for a life of meticulous detail. The note was a list of materials for the chair, but at the bottom there was a sentence in a hurried scrawl. "Dad, if we make this big, we'll need to protect the intellectual property. Let's make sure we have a watertight contract." And then another sentence in even smaller script, almost hidden in the corner. "I talked to the lawyer. He said we need to file a separate ownership form for the design. He said the design itself is separate from the physical product. Dad, please don't lose this. We need it." My heart hammered in my chest. I stared at the note, my eyes trying to make sense of the words. It was a note from a different Julian, a boy who was still dreaming of a partnership. It was a clue, a buried clue from a past he had tried to erase. I looked at the words again. The design itself is separate from the physical product. He had told me he couldn't give me the blueprints, that they belonged to the company. But he had forgotten something. He had forgotten the old legal form that separated the intellectual property from the product. He had forgotten the paper trail he had created for me, the one he had thought was worthless. He had thought the only thing that mattered was the physical chair, the thing he had sold. But the real treasure, the real power was in the design. He had sold the chair, but he had never sold the design. I gripped the note, my fingers trembling. The pain in my chest was still there, a deep gnawing agony, but it was joined by a new feeling, a feeling of grim, bitter satisfaction. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated the man who knew that a blueprint was worth more than a piece of wood. He had thought my life was a useless, worthless thing, but he had overlooked the most important thing of all. He had overlooked the fact that the things that mattered the most were not for sale. He had thought he could buy me out of my life, but he had overlooked a small, insignificant piece of paper that held the key to my victory. I sat there in the silence of my workshop, the scent of sawdust and dust in the air, and I knew that the game was not over. It was just beginning. Julian was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. He was about to learn that you can't build a future on the ruins of your past. The flimsy, yellowed paper felt as heavy as lead in my hands. The note from Julian, the one I had found tucked inside the old blueprints for our chair, was more than a clue. It was a weapon. The design itself is separate from the physical product. His own words, the meticulous, precise scrawl of the boy who had dreamed of building things with his father, now became my key to survival. For weeks, the pain of his betrayal had been a dull, constant ache in my chest, a grief that had been too deep to shed in tears. But now it was gone. In its place, a cold, hard resolve had settled in an icy calm that came from knowing I finally had a way to fight back. I spent the next few days in a different kind of fog. My hands, once restless and empty, were now busy with purpose. I found a lawyer, an old quiet man from a small firm, a few towns over, who looked at the note and the blueprints with a growing sense of awe. He told me that Julian, in his haste and ambition, had made a critical, fundamental mistake. He had signed away his company's rights to a physical product, but he had never secured the intellectual property of the design itself. The designs, the blueprints, the very heart of the chair belonged to me, to Reyes and Son. The lawyer, a man who spoke in careful, measured tones, told me that I had all the leverage I needed. The firm Julian worked for, a company that was a towering symbol of his success, was now vulnerable to a lawsuit that could cost them millions, a scandal that could tear down their reputation, and Julian's along with it. The plan formed in my mind not as a desperate act of rage, but as a cold, calculated strategy. I would not send a letter. I would not send my lawyer. I would confront him myself. This was not a business deal. This was personal. The fight for my home, for my life, would not be fought in a courtroom. It would be fought face to face in his world, on his turf. I put on the only suit I owned, a dark, well-worn thing I usually reserved for funerals and family gatherings. It felt foreign on me, a heavy, ill-fitting armor. I felt out of place, a man of wood and sawdust in a world of glass and steel. The drive into the city was a quiet, surreal journey. The world I was entering was a different one entirely, a world of towering buildings and sleek, silent cars. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and concrete, a stark contrast to the fresh, clean air of my workshop. I felt a sense of dread and anticipation, a sickening feeling of stepping into a battle I might not win. Julian's firm was in a building that scraped the clouds, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to mock the humble, handmade quality of my life. I stepped into the lobby, a vast, cavernous space of polished marble and cold, impersonal art. The air was cool and sterile, a sterile, manufactured calm that felt like a lie. A receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly coiffed haircut and a thin, professional smile, asked me who I was there to see. I told her I was here to see Julian Reyes. She looked at me with a polite, vacant look and then asked if I had an appointment. I told her no, but that he would want to see me. She gave me a doubtful look and told me to wait. I sat in a sleek, minimalist chair, feeling like a ghost from a different time. My hands, stained and calloused, looked foreign against the pristine, polished surface of the table. I watched the people passing by, their faces a blur of ambition and purpose. They were Julian's people. They moved with a quick, nervous energy, a constant, low-level anxiety that seemed to be a part of their very being. After what felt like an eternity, the receptionist's phone rang, and she spoke in hushed tones, her eyes flicking nervously in my direction. She hung up, and with a tight, nervous smile, she told me that Julian would see me now. Julian's office was at the top of the building, a glass-walled cage that looked down on the city below. The view was breathtaking and terrifying, a vast, impersonal landscape of concrete and steel. His desk, a long, stark rectangle of black polished stone, was completely bare, save for a single tablet. He stood up when I walked in, his face, a perfect mask of polite indifference. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how I was. He looked at me as if I were a client. He didn't recognize an unfortunate surprise he was forced to endure. He simply gestured to the chair in front of his desk and told me to sit down. His voice was calm, professional, and completely devoid of emotion. I sat down, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. Julian's face was sharp and hard, a man who had long since forgotten how to be soft. I saw the ghost of the boy. He had once been the boy with the same blue eyes as his mother, the boy who had once been so full of a different kind of purpose. I felt the familiar pang of paternal love, the gut-wrenching pain of a father who had lost his son, but it was quickly replaced by a new feeling, a feeling of grim, bitter satisfaction. He had underestimated me. He had thought I was a simple man, a man he could buy off, a man he could break. He was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Julian broke the silence. He said he was sorry he had to do this, that it was just a business deal. He said he was doing this for my own good. He said the money would give me a new life, a new start. He spoke in the practiced, condescending tone of a man who was used to getting his way, a man who was used to people caving in to his demands. He was a professional. He was a master of a kind of communication that said nothing at all. He told me that the offer was non-negotiable. He said that if I didn't take the money, they would find a way to take the land anyway. He said it was just a matter of time. I looked at him, and for the first time in years I saw the fear in his eyes. It was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker, but it was there. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of lies and deceit, a man who was now about to face the consequences of his actions. I took a deep breath and I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I spoke in a voice that was calm and steady, a voice that was full of the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime of work. I told him I wasn't here to talk about a business deal. I told him I wasn't here to talk about money. I told him I was here to talk about a different kind of deal. His face, the perfect mask of indifference, began to crack. He looked at me with a flicker of confusion. He asked me what I was talking about. I looked at him and I told him I was talking about the chair we had built together, the one he had sold for a paycheck. I saw the shock in his eyes, the deep-seated fear of a man who had just been reminded of a ghost he had tried to bury. He stammered, his perfect composure shattering. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. I told him I was talking about Reyes and Son. The name, a symbol of our shattered partnership, hung in the air like a bitter accusation. He looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He said that was in the past. He said it didn't matter anymore. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old yellowed blueprints. They were folded and wrinkled, the kind of paper that had a history, a story to tell. I placed them on his cold, sterile desk. The paper, a tangible relic from a different world, was a brutal contrast to the sleek, modern aesthetic of his office. He looked at the blueprints, and I saw his mind working frantically, trying to make sense of the situation. I told him I was talking about the design that was legally mine. I told him that he had sold the physical product, but he had never sold the intellectual property. I told him I had the paperwork, the evidence, the legal right to shut his firm down. Julian's face went white. The perfect mask of indifference was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. He looked at the blueprints, and then he looked at me. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, a silence that was full of the unspoken words of a father who was betraying his own son. He stammered, his voice a raw, desperate plea. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. He said I was crazy. I looked at him, and with a voice that was both sad and full of a grim, bitter satisfaction, I told him that I was going to expose him. I was going to expose him to his clients, to his partners, to the world. I was going to tear down the world he had built, a world that was built on lies and betrayal. He looked at me with the eyes of a cornered animal, a man who had finally run out of places to hide. He said I couldn't do this. I told him I could. He said I was a monster. I looked at him, and I felt the pain, the deep, gut-wrenching pain of a father who had to hurt his own son. I told him that he had left me with no choice. I told him he had betrayed me, he had betrayed his mother's memory, and he had betrayed everything that we had ever stood for. I told him that I wasn't a monster. I was just a father who was trying to protect his home, his life, and his legacy. The confrontation had been more brutal than I had ever imagined. The pain was a physical thing, a cold knot in my gut that no amount of work or quiet reflection could untangle. I looked at him, and I saw the desperate, scared boy he had once been. I saw the boy who had come to me with a dream of building a partnership, and I saw the man he had become, a man who had sold his soul for a paycheck. I stood up, my legs trembling, and I looked at him one last time. I told him I wasn't a monster. I was just a father who had to do what was right. He looked at me, and I saw the shame, the guilt, the regret, a flicker of humanity that I had not seen in years. And then I turned and I walked away. I left the blueprints on his desk, a silent promise of the battle to come. I had won the battle, but the war for his soul was far from over. I had wounded my own flesh and blood, and I was left with a deep, profound sadness. The elevator doors closed behind me, a final, damning statement. I had come to his world, and I had fought his battle, and I had won. But the victory was a bitter, hollow thing. I had lost my son, and I had lost a piece of my heart. And I knew that the pain of this victory would haunt me for the rest of my life. The silence in the elevator on the way down felt even heavier than the silence in Julian's office. I had walked out, leaving the crumpled blueprints on his pristine desk like a final, damning statement. The doors hissed open into the vast, sterile lobby, and I felt the cold, polished marble beneath my feet. I walked past the receptionist who didn't dare meet my gaze and out into the city's cacophony. The roar of the traffic, the blare of horns, the urgent, impersonal energy of the people rushing past, all of it felt like a soundscape to a war I had just declared. My hands, still trembling, slightly felt alien and out of place. They were the hands of a man who built things, not of a man who tore them down. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that tearing down Julian's world was the only way to save my own. I didn't go home. I found a diner on a quiet side street, a place of formica counters and the comforting smell of old coffee. I sat in a vinyl booth, my suit feeling stiff and foreign, and ordered a cup. The waitress, a kind woman with a tired smile, didn't ask me any questions. She just refilled my cup, sensing perhaps the immense weight I was carrying. My mind was a relentless churning sea of anger, regret, and a profound, bone-deep sadness. I had gone to my son's world and had delivered my judgment. But the victory, if you could call it that, was a bitter, hollow thing. There was no joy, no sense of triumph, only a grim, cold satisfaction that came from knowing I had done what I had to do. After my third cup of coffee, I pulled out my phone. My hands were still shaking, but my purpose was clear. I called my lawyer, a man who had a quiet, methodical way about him. I told him in a voice that was calm and steady that it was time to proceed. He didn't ask for details, only said that he would file the injunction and the lawsuit immediately. He said something about the importance of speed in these matters, about how the element of surprise was key. I told him I understood. I hung up the phone and watched the city from the window, a vast, impersonal landscape of steel and glass, a monument to the world my son had built, a monument that was now finally starting to crack. The die was cast. The game was no longer mine to control. The truth was about to be unleashed. The phone call from my lawyer came 2 days later, a cold, clinical report of the devastation that was unfolding in Julian's world. He told me that the injunction had been filed, a public document that named Julian's firm and his new residential project. The lawsuit, a formal accusation of copyright infringement and breach of contract, had been delivered to their offices. My lawyer said that the news had spread like wildfire. The financial news outlets, the architectural journals, the online forums, they were all buzzing with the story. The small private battle between a father and son had become a public scandal, a story about betrayal, about a son trying to take his father's home, and a simple man standing up to a corporate giant. My lawyer said that the firm's stock was plummeting, that their investors were calling in a panic, and that the project was on indefinite hold. He said Julian had been summoned to a series of urgent meetings with the firm's partners and their lawyers. He said Julian's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. As he spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a grim, brutal satisfaction in hearing the consequences of Julian's actions, but there was also a deep, gut-wrenching pain. I had set a fire and the flames were now consuming my own flesh and blood. I had won the battle, but I had lost my son. The victory was a hollow, empty thing. The call from Julian came later that day. I almost didn't answer it. The phone rang with a sense of urgent, desperate panic that was a stark contrast to the quiet, professional tone he had used before. I let it ring. He tried again, and again. On the fifth try, I answered. Julian's voice, the voice of a man who was used to being in control, was now a raw, desperate plea. He said I couldn't do this, that I was ruining him. He said I was a monster. He said I was destroying everything he had worked for. His words were a torrent of accusations and desperate pleas, a desperate, frantic attempt to regain control. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the sound of his world shattering. He was a man who had built a life on a foundation of lies and deceit, a man who was now facing the consequences of his actions. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, profound sadness. This was not a victory. This was a tragedy. His voice finally broke. He said that he was sorry, that he didn't know what to say. He said he had made a mistake. I said nothing. I just listened. He said he had to go. He said he had another meeting. The phone went silent. He had hung up. He had delivered his final desperate plea, and then he had walked away. He was not a boy anymore. A boy who had once come to me with a dream of a partnership. He was a man who had sold his soul for a paycheck, a man who was now facing the consequences of his actions. The next day, an expensive black car pulled up to my workshop. I saw a man in a perfectly tailored suit emerge from the passenger side, a man who moved with the kind of calculated grace I had only seen in Julian. It was his senior partner. He had come to my world, to my home, to the place he had dismissed as a dilapidated mess. I felt a grim, bitter satisfaction. He was a man who worked with money and influence, a man who was used to people caving in to his demands. He was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. He walked into my workshop, his polished shoes scuffing the sawdust on the floor. He looked around at the projects, at the tools, at the things I had built with my hands, and I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He introduced himself in a quiet, professional tone. He said he was a partner at Julian's firm, a colleague. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, a silent, unyielding wall. He got straight to the point. He said he was here to make a formal offer. He said his firm was prepared to offer me a massive sum of money, far more than my property was worth, to make the lawsuit go away and prevent any further public scandal. He said that this was a generous offer, a final act of good faith. I listened to him, the sound of his words, a bitter mockery of everything I had ever believed in. He was a man who thought that everything could be bought, that every problem could be solved with a check. I looked at him and I told him that I wasn't for sale. I told him that my home, my legacy, my honor were not for sale. He looked at me with a flicker of confusion. He said he didn't understand. I looked at him, and I told him that he wouldn't. He was a man who had sold his soul for a paycheck, a man who would never understand the value of an honest day's work. He tried to reason with me. He said that Julian was a good kid, that he had a bright future, that this was just a mistake. I looked at him and I told him that it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I told him that Julian had chosen to betray me, to betray his mother's memory, to betray everything that we had ever stood for. He was a man who had chosen to build a life on a foundation of lies and deceit. He said he was sorry he had to do it this way, but that I had left him with no choice. I looked at him, and I told him that Julian had made his choice years ago, and that the consequences were now his to bear. I told him that a man who builds things with his hands is not so easily broken. I told him that a life of honest work and love is worth more than any amount of money. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had just been defeated. He stammered, his perfect composure shattering. He said he would be in touch. He walked out of my workshop, his polished shoes scuffing the sawdust on the floor, and I watched him get back into his expensive black car. I stood in the silence of my workshop, the scent of sawdust and dust in the air, and I felt the weight of my victory, a bitter, hollow thing. I had won the battle, but I had lost my son, and I knew that the pain of this victory would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was a man who had to do what was right, and I had done it. But the price was higher than I had ever imagined. The lawsuit was settled in a series of swift, brutal negotiations. My lawyer, a man who spoke with the quiet, methodical precision of a craftsman, informed me in a voice devoid of emotion that the firm had agreed to a permanent injunction. The plans for the residential complex were dead. The land where my workshop stood declared off limits. They had also agreed to a significant settlement, a number so large it felt obscene, a corporate apology in the form of cold hard cash. He said they had to protect their brand, and that the public scandal, the constant buzzing of reporters, and the endless flood of online outrage was hurting them more than any lawsuit could. He spoke as if it were a game, a contest of leverage and strategic maneuvering. But for me, it was never a game. It was a tragedy. Julian's name was mentioned only in passing, a footnote in a larger, more impersonal narrative. My lawyer told me that Julian had been placed on an indefinite leave of absence, his career in ruins. He didn't say more, and I didn't ask. I hung up the phone and stood in the silent workshop, the scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine in the air. The victory was complete. My home was safe. My legacy was secure. But the silence that followed felt heavier than any loss. The victory was a hollow, empty thing, a triumph that had come at the cost of my son. I had won the battle, but I had lost the war for his soul. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet routine. I went through the motions of a man in his life, but my mind was a restless, churning sea. The workshop, once my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every object in it, the smooth grain of a maple plank, the gleaming steel of a chisel, the warm glow of a lamp I had made for Sarah, reminded me of Julian, not the man who had come for Thanksgiving, but the boy he had once been. The lawsuit, the public scandal, the entire sordid affair, felt like a ghost, a haunting memory of a life that had been shattered by a single act of betrayal. Julian's silence was a new, more profound kind of pain. The frantic, desperate phone calls had stopped. The torrent of accusations and desperate pleas had ceased. There was only a cold, deafening silence. It was the silence of a man who had run out of words, a man who had nothing left to say. I had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that he would call, that he would apologize, that he would finally acknowledge the hurt he had caused. But there was nothing. The silence was his final, definitive statement. He had moved on. He had let go. He had, in a sense, made his final, most cruel choice. He had chosen to disappear. Then the car arrived. It wasn't the sleek, expensive car I had seen on Thanksgiving, the one that hummed with a quiet, confident dignity I didn't understand. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its paint peeling, its engine groaning. It was the kind of car a man drives when he has nothing left to lose. I saw Julian get out of the car, a ghost from a different time. He wasn't in a perfectly tailored suit. He was wearing a simple jacket and a pair of worn-out jeans. He was a man who looked like he had been sleeping in his car. His shoulders were slumped, his jaw slack, his face a hollow, empty mask of defeat. He didn't look at the house, didn't seem to notice the peeling paint or the rusted hinge on the front gate. His eyes, the same piercing blue as Sarah's, were fixed on the workshop door, a closed-off, impenetrable wall. He walked into the room, and the silence thickened, becoming something you could almost touch. The air, already heavy, grew colder. He offered a perfunctory nod in my direction. There was no warmth in it, no sense of homecoming. It was the gesture of a stranger acknowledging a brief acquaintance. He didn't meet my gaze, choosing instead to look at the tools on the workbench, the stacks of lumber, the things that defined my life. He looked at the things he had tried to destroy, the things he had dismissed as a dilapidated mess. He spoke first, his voice, a low, raw whisper that seemed to break against the oppressive silence. He told me he hadn't come to apologize. He said he didn't know how. He said he had come because he had to. He said he couldn't go on pretending. He said he had to look at me, at the man he had tried to destroy. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, a silent, unyielding wall. He looked at me, and I saw a flicker of the old Julian, the boy with the sawdust in his hair, the boy who had once looked at me with a different kind of purpose. But it was quickly replaced by a new feeling, a feeling of grim, bitter satisfaction. He had come here not to make amends, but to admit defeat. He told me about the last few weeks, about the partners who had turned on him, about the investors who had pulled out, about the clients who had left. He spoke as if it were a series of unfortunate events, as if he were an innocent bystander to a tragedy he had set in motion. He said that his carefully constructed world had been built on a foundation of lies and deceit, a foundation that had finally crumbled beneath him. He looked at me, and with a voice that was both apologetic and utterly dismissive, he told me that he had gotten everything he deserved. He said he had lost everything, but that it was a fair trade. He was a man who had sold his soul for a paycheck, a man who was now facing the consequences of his actions. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, profound sadness. This was not a victory. This was a tragedy. He sat down on a dusty old stool, the kind of seat a man uses when he is exhausted, and looked around the workshop. He saw the projects, the tools, the things I had built with my hands, and I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. He said he had to tell me something he had never told me before. He told me he had hated this place. He had hated the sawdust, the smell of pine, the constant low-level hum of the machines. He said he had hated the fact that his father was a simple man, a man who worked with his hands. He said he had wanted more. He had wanted a life of glass and steel, a life of power and influence. He had wanted a life that was completely different from mine. His words, a bitter, cruel truth, hit me like a physical blow. He had not just betrayed me, he had hated me. He had hated the life I had built for us. I felt the familiar pain in my chest, the cold knot of grief and betrayal. I looked at him, and with a voice that was both sad and full of a grim, bitter satisfaction, I told him that he had lost. I told him he had lost not just a battle, but a war for his own soul. I told him he had chosen to build a life on a foundation of lies and deceit, and that a life of lies and deceit is not a life at all. I told him that the things that mattered the most were not for sale. I told him that a life of honest work and love is worth more than any amount of money. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had just been defeated. He said he was sorry he had to do it this way, but that he had left him with no choice. I looked at him, and I told him that he had made his choice years ago, and that the consequences were now his to bear. I told him that a man who builds things with his hands is not so easily broken. I told him that a life of honest work and love is worth more than any amount of money. He stood up, his legs trembling, and he looked at me one last time. He said that he had to go. He said he had to figure out what was left. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for a second chance. He just turned and walked away. I watched him leave his shoulders, slumped his footsteps, a quiet, mournful sound on the sawdust-covered floor. He walked out of my workshop, out of my life, a ghost from a different time. I stood there, and I felt the weight of my victory, a bitter, hollow thing. I had won the battle, but I had lost my son. And I knew that the pain of this victory would haunt me for the rest of my life. I walked to the table and sat down. My hands, the honest hands of a craftsman, felt foreign to me. They were hands that built things, not hands that were meant to hold onto something that was being ripped away. The workshop was a sanctuary again, a quiet, peaceful place of wood and sawdust, a place of honest work and quiet reflection. The memory of Julian, the boy with the sawdust in his hair, the boy who had once looked at me with a different kind of purpose, was still there, but it was a different kind of memory. It was a memory of a life that had been a life that was now over. I had done what I had to do. I had stood for what was right. And in doing so, I had found a different kind of peace. A peace that came from knowing you had done the right thing, even when the cost was everything. The sun set outside, casting long, pale shadows on the workshop floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sawdust, the familiar perfume of my life's work. My hands, still steady and strong despite the years, bore the indelible marks of a man who worked with wood. Every callus, every scar told a story of a beam hewn, a table crafted, a chair carved. They were honest hands, the kind that built things. They were the hands of a man who had lost his son, but they were also the hands of a man who had finally found peace. I looked at a piece of wood, a beautiful uncut plank of maple. I ran my hands over its smooth, warm surface, and I felt a new kind of purpose settle in a quiet, determined resolve. I had a lot of work to do. I had a lot of things to build. I had a life to live. And I was going to live it with a new sense of purpose, a new sense of peace, a new sense of acceptance. The past was over. The future was now. And I was ready to face it. The clock on the mantel ticked on a quiet, relentless rhythm that seemed to be a final, comforting statement. The past was over. The future was now. And I was ready to face it. This is the end of the story. I hope you found it to be a meaningful and impactful experience. If you would like to explore another story, please let me know.